So, good afternoon, everyone, once again. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to the second installment of our FLOS lectures, the online lecture series of the ERC Starting Grant Project Florilegia Syriaca. The first installment, which took place in the spring and summer of 2021, mostly concentrated on Florilegia proper and the Syriac reception of Greek patristic literature, and only occasionally on metaphysical or philosophical problems. We had anyways 2 lectures on this. This new series is betrayed by its title, Patristic Metaphysics, the Birth of a New Philosophy from the Crucible of Theology, rather and more specifically focuses on the crucial philosophical developments that are at the origin of and always underlie the transfer, the selection, and the rearrangement of Greek patristic sources in Florilegia. Indeed, the main topic of our project, Syriac patristic Florilegia of the 8th to 10th century, are almost always actively theoretical and only apparently passive compilatory works, which presuppose and also contribute to what today's speaker, Johannes Zachhuber, rightly termed patristic philosophy. The history of this philosophy, which was born in the course of long and complex theological debates on the Trinity and the Incarnation, and often remained inseparable from them, this history is exquisitely Greek in its roots, but is multilingual, multicultural, and multi-confessional in its centuries-long developments, of which Syriac Florilegia are but a prominent episode. In this series of lectures, we will rather explore these multiple chronological, cultural, and linguistic dimensions, and today we are going to inaugurate this exploration under the guide of the scholar who produced the most advanced and wide-ranging reflections on the most theoretical dimension of patristic culture. Indeed, it is a great honor and pleasure to be opening this new series of FLOS lectures with the contribution of a highly distinguished guest, Johannes Zachhuber, who since 2014 has been the professor of historical and systematic theology in the Faculty of Theology at the University of Oxford, where he is a fellow of Trinity College. In Oxford, he also earned his PhD in 1997, and after assistant and junior professorships in Berlin, he went back to Oxford in 2005. Professor Zachhuber is renowned both among patristic scholars and historians of theology at large for his wide range of interests and the importance of his studies, especially in the fields of patristics and of German theology of the 19th century. His first monograph was devoted to human nature in Gregory of Nyssa and was published by Brill in 1999. Another major monographic work, which I would much like to remind, was his Theology as Science in 19th century Germany, from Ferdinand Christian Bauer to Ernst Troeltsch, published by Oxford University Press in 2013. Most recently, he published a nice booklet on time and soul, from Aristotle to St. Augustine, which was published by De Grooter little more than 1 month ago, if I am correct. He's also the editor or co-editor of many important collective volumes in the last 2 decades, among which the very recent Ferdinand Christian Bauer, a reader, and then the Oxford Handbook of 19th Century Christian Thought, Individuality in Late Antiquity, Sacrifice, and Modern Thought. The book that particularly stands in our spotlight today, however, is a brilliant monograph he published in 2020, The Rise of Christian Theology and the End of Ancient Metaphysics, Patristic Philosophy from the Cappadocian Fathers to John of Damascus, a great tour de force across patristic metaphysics, spanning 4 centuries of Greek Christian thought on Trinity and Christology. The book is the achievement of at least 15 years of work around these topics and is stunning, both for the width of its overview and for the spasmodic, I would say, auscultation of fine textual details and of minimal theoretical variations, through which Professor Zachhuber is able to extrapolate the major philosophical models and their historical developments. As the title of his lecture indicates, the title is Patristic Philosophy in the 6th Century, Trends and Controversies. Professor Zachhuber will talk to us today about some crucially significant moments in the philosophical developments he outlined in this recent book. So, Professor Zachhuber, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Emilio, for these extremely kind words and for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak to you all today. I said a minute ago, before everybody else joined, that it's such an exciting thing for me to observe that after I more or less worked by myself on this topic for so many years, there is now really this growing field of people who add to my own findings, especially where I really feel I've at best perhaps scratched the surface, namely in an appreciation of the plurality and diversity of patristic philosophy, especially in the centuries after Chalcedon. Okay, that's how it works. I should warn you all that I have a bit of a cold. I'll try my best to keep the effects to a minimum. Now, obviously, I'm not sure how familiar everybody here is with all the aspects of this topic. And as Emilio just said, it is still a relatively recent field, right? Patristic philosophy, or perhaps more in a more secular register, we can also say early Christian philosophy. So I want to devote a first part of my lecture simply to explain what it means, or perhaps a bit more humbly, to explain what I mean by that. What is patristic philosophy? How can philosophy be Christian? Now, I approach that question by means in a somewhat oblique way. There is a debate, or there was a debate in sort of in the mid 20th century in France, which, as far as I can tell, outside France, certainly only very few people are aware of, which I think is a shame. And that was a debate really about the possibility of Christian philosophy. On the one hand stood more secularly minded philosophers such as Émile Brillet. On the other side, the eminent Catholic philosopher Etienne Gilson, where Brillet more or less said there can't be something like a Christian philosophy. Philosophy is philosophy, and whatever your background, you're either right or wrong. Gilson, on the other hand, said, well, I mean, Christianity comes with the claim of being the true faith. And if that is at all taken seriously, there must also be a sort of philosophical equivalent to that. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of that debate, but what's really interesting, what's relevant for my topic, for patristic philosophy, is that there were a number of, I feel, sort of really interesting offshoots of that debate. The most well-known one, probably more better known nowadays than the actual debate around Gilson and his opponents, was Pierre Hadot, who, on the basis, in order to sort of move forward in that debate, embarked on his very influential attempt to sort of redefine ancient philosophy as a way of life. Another person who I felt gave a very helpful sort of offshoot of that debate was Gustave Pardy. Gustave Pardy and a bit later Anne-Marie Malin-Gray both said, okay, well, let's just look at patristic texts and see what these early Christian authors actually think about philosophy. And what they discovered was that how consistently Christian authors, actually way earlier than the 4th century, think of their own work as philosophy. And I think that is actually a really helpful insight. And it's helpful because very often the debate about philosophy and patristics, which is, of course, well represented in scholarly literature, is presented as something of an alternative between the idea that Christianity or Christian fathers, Christian theologians, were somehow unphilosophical, not really interested in philosophical topics for whatever reason, more spiritual, more exegetical, whatever. On the other hand, these sort of well-worn theories of the church fathers as being Platonists or being just pupils or followers of certain pre-Christian philosophical schools. And I think that if we follow the research by people like Pardy and Malingre, we can see that there's actually a third between those. Now, the way I want to phrase that, and I admit that it is perhaps controversial, but it helps, and it would need qualification. But as in an analogous sense, I would say we can perhaps understand a Christianity a bit like one of the philosophical schools. Now, what I mean by that is we can, if we do that, we can see why, in fact, the interaction between Christian authors and other, what we normally call philosophical authors, such as Platonists and Stoics, was mostly polemical. Well, it was polemical, but obviously the interaction between Peripatetics and Stoics and Platonists was also mostly polemical. But at the same time, we can then also understand in what ways the polemic in which the church fathers engaged vis-a-vis philosophical schools was also, we could say, predicated on an analogy between their work. There is a sense in which they offer the correct philosophy, whereas the pagan philosophers got it wrong. And I would go a step further and say the same analogy is also interestingly recognized by some of the most prominent opponents of Christianity. Now, it's very interesting that a lot of the opponents of Christianity in late antiquity were philosophers, like Celsus, Porphyry, in a way, Julian, Emperor Julian. So why is it that these people write against Christianity? Well, they think that Christianity is bad philosophy, right? But it's still interesting that they write about it. They recognize Christianity in a way aspires to be philosophy, even though, from their point of view, Christians get it all wrong. Now, still in my first introductory section, I feel I've kind of given a sense what I think, in what sense we can speak of patristic philosophy, what that term can mean. But what is it? Now, one interesting thing I've observed in my own research is that beginning, I would say, in sort of the mid-5th century, roughly speaking, we find increasingly attempts in patristic authors to consciously define key terms of the theological debate. Well, people had done it previously, but it becomes more systematic and more of a conscious effort at that time. And what we often find in those definitions is an explicit distinction between definitions as they are understood by outside philosophers on the one hand and by the fathers on the other. I give you just one example, the Aranistes by Theodoret of Sarras. The Aranistes starts off, it's a dialogue, right? And the Orthodox speaker says, well, we have to begin with, we have to define the key terms, ousia, apostasis, prosopon, idiotas. And then I quote this, so that we may know and define what difference they have from each other. And he says we have to do that ourselves because Christians should not slavishly follow the notions, the definitions, the ideas that they find in pagan thinkers. So what does that mean? Well, for example, Orthodox says, as far as pagan philosophers are concerned, ousia and hypostasis have basically the same meaning. There's no real difference between them. But, and here, the operative phrase, in the teaching of the fathers, they do. Here's the quote, the same difference the universal has to the particular, or the genus to the species, or the individual, ousia has to hypostases. So I don't want to go into the details of what this means for Theodoret. Is really just an example. And the example, the reason I offer it here, the reason I cite it here is that we can see very beautifully here how Theodoret thinks about Christianity. It is a philosophy. It has its own definitions, but these definitions are different from the kind of definitions that are used in other philosophical schools. And just as a sidebar, I'm not going into that, but I suspect actually for some of the people working on the FLOS project, that is potentially important. This idea that definitions of terms are needed becomes actually really important in later centuries, and it's actually it's a genre of literature really where all these definitions are collected, and it gets longer and longer as we go into the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries. But I'm not going to say more about that. But again, you can see it's sort of the seed is in an author like Theodoret. Okay, so, but what does it mean that the fathers define terms in this particular sense, as the Orthodox in Theodoret claims? Well, it means that the origins of what's understood as Christian philosophy from the 5th century at the latest is really lies in the teaching of the 3 4th century bishops, who usually known by the moniker the 3 Cappadocians, namely Basil the Great, Gregory Nazianzus, and Gregory of Nyssa. Now, these 3 became famous, uniquely famous, I think, in later Christian orthodoxy, because they've developed a conceptual and terminological frame for settling the Trinitarian debate. And as I sometimes like to say, this is important not just because the Trinity is important for Christians, but it is, I think, important because in some ways it is the one doctrinal debate that the Christian Church in some ways actually managed to settle once and for all, right? Christology, of course, they didn't really, and most other doctrinal debates also just went on and stayed controversial. And so I think this is why it was always seen as such a monumental achievement. There is a way that doctrinal debates can actually be settled, and the Cappadocians showed us how it's done. So I can't go, as you know, I'm supposed to talk about the 6th century, so I can't say too much about the Cappadocians, but I would say that exactly as the Orthodox in Theodoret indicates, the key terms in the Cappadocian settlement are indeed ousia, substance, which is often equated with nature, physis, and on the other hand, hypostases. And these terms are indeed understood as universal and particular. I call the Cappadocian theory a classical theory. And by that, I mean, again, Theodoret being a really good example. By that, I mean that from, I think, the early mid-5th century onwards, really only a few decades after it was codified by Gregory of Nyssa, mostly, the youngest of the 3, it is in a way taken for granted. It's not associated with the school. It's not seen as controversial. It's not seen as a sort of a party opinion. It is just seen as the teaching of the fathers. And if we had to summarize this classical theory, we'd have to say, well, ousia is one, being is one, but being only exists or subsists in a plurality of individuals or hypostases. Now, to say just make one further comment here, this classical theory exists in the Cappadocians, I think, in 2 dimensions. It is on the one hand, there is on the one hand an abstract dimension where it's in some ways really a logical theory. And in this abstract dimension, ousia is spoken of as the account of being, as the totality of properties that are shared by all members of a class. Whereas hypostases can be seen as the individuating property, like fatherhood in the case of the Father in the Trinity. On the other hand, there's also the concrete dimension where the theory is more about ontology than about logic, and there the ousia or the physis is the whole, the totality, which consists of the hypostases as its parts. Both of them, I think, in the Cappadocians are seen as just 2 aspects of one and the same reality. And we can see why that is and why that's not a problem when we consider that the Trinitarian settlement is really the basis of the Cappadocian settlement, where there is obviously one God, and the one God only exists in the 3 hypostases, but the 3 hypostases together somehow are also the one God, and at the same time they can be distinguished by means of properties that are either shared between all three of them or are distinctive of an individual hypothesis. So in sum, patristic philosophy, we could say, is the formalization of analytic principles underwriting orthodox doctrine. Well, that is at least how I want to understand it. Of course, you can say, is this all there is to patristic philosophy? And I'd be very open to accepting that there are also other aspects or dimensions. I actually think what this very simple summary gives you a foundation for understanding an enormous, a considerable breadth of a patristic philosophical text. Now, my next section is entitled 6th Century Developments. And I begin, sorry, I begin with some general observations. And the first one is that the 6th century in patristic thought is still little known, which is a shame, because I think that even if we leave aside the sort of aspect of political history, which is also fascinating, and just focus on doctrinal developments, I would say the 6th century is sort of as interesting and as complex as the 4th. And it's incredibly worth studying. The problem is, for now, any attempt to do so is hampered by the lack of studies on almost all major aspects of that story. So the first way in which the first thing we have to say about these developments in the 6th century is that this is the time when the Christological debate really heats up. It becomes much broader, much more extensive, much more sophisticated than it ever was in the 5th century, in the decades leading up to Ephesus and Chalcedon. Of course, this is partly due to the fact, and that's my second point here, Christendom enters into its first permanent schism. And the Christological controversy becomes more expansive and more sophisticated, partly because these different blocks that emerge from this schism are just are sort of in constant controversy and battle with each other and try to argue for their respective positions as best they can. So these three rival blocks are obviously, and not necessarily here in order of importance, Chalcedonian camp, the Miaphysites, and the East Syrians. Again, I think it's fair to say that for all three of them, the 6th century is absolutely key in seeing them develop their own elaborate philosophies in support of their own particular take on Christology. In some ways, for those, in some ways, I think the 6th century situation with regard to Christology can be compared with the 16th century in Europe, where likewise from the Reformation, these rival camps emerge. And what we then have is this a development or emergence of huge sort of doctrinal apparatuses that are constructed to support the confessional stance of the rival religious groups. And because that is the way it is in the 6th century, because that's the way it is, actually, I would say the only really acceptable way to study and to understand doctrinal development, philosophical development in Christianity during that period is comparative. And the reason I say that is because it's still rarely done. It's still the case. I mean, I've said this, too little literature as it is, but even the literature that exists is so often just focused on the development within the Chalcedonian church. But that is not giving us a full picture. That's not giving us a true picture. In many ways, it's really giving us a completely distorted picture. There's no scholarly justification for that. Now, having said that, you can say I dug a deep hole for myself, because today I'm really not doing it because I don't have the time for it. And instead, what I'll do and what follows is really focus on a couple of problems that I think are common due to the way the constellation, philosophical constellation develops at the time. Now let me, gosh, time's flying here. Let me very briefly mention here another reason why I think the 6th century is worth studying is that actually on the back of the Christological controversy, there are suddenly a number of, we might say, spin-offs that are also each in their own right incredibly fascinating, like the controversies about aphthartism, about tritheism, about the resurrection of the body. Now, if the 6th century in general isn't well researched, these specific controversies often, I mean, there's often hardly any research on them. So don't even try to find a relevant literature, but they are utterly fascinating. And the reason I mention them here is I think they're particularly important if we look at this whole constellation from the angle of patristic philosophy. Why is that? Well, I think the emergence of these sort of sideshow debates shows how that there's a really clear perception among all participants in these debates that conceptual coherence matters, right? If you use a certain principle, if you use a certain argument in Christology, then it should be legitimate to use the same principle also in other parts of Christian doctrine. And that shows, I think, that the hypothesis that there's a kind of patristic philosophy sort of underwriting a lot of these debates is something that was of which discussants at the time were also aware. One more general observation, and again, it's really just for flagging up, but it is crucial for understanding anything that's going on. Okay, so there is a sophistication of philosophical arguments, but it is also important to see that the importance of patristic texts as an authority grows massively during the 6th century. And what we find is a full spectrum. On the one hand, very, very careful and extensive exegetical analysis of a huge patristic corpus. For example, in the very scholarly but extremely dull treatise by Peter of Callinicus, which is published under the title Against Damian. On the other hand, we have sort of more for the sort of daily use by people who can't spend their whole life in libraries, the production of excerpts in Florilegia. And so that's really more what you can use if you need to defeat your rival Miaphysite bishop in your own town. Why is that important for patristic philosophy? Well, I think it's important to see that patristic philosophy isn't just constructive, it's actually in large part hermeneutical. The definitions we're talking about, which people collect, are often developed from existing authoritative text. And this means, I've said earlier that there is an attempt to be coherent, and I think that is true, but we also have to be aware that there's a degree of eclecticism, or at least latitude, that we also just have to accept. I think for anybody studying late ancient philosophy, this is no news, this isn't surprising. If you read the Aristotelian commentators, we find exactly the same thing there, that because you're dealing with an authoritative text, you have to adapt your analysis to an extent to the material you're dealing with. And if in that corpus terms are used in a variety of meanings, well, then so it is. Okay, now I've come to my main argument here for the remaining time. And I come to my fundamental thesis about the patristic philosophy in the 6th century. My fundamental thesis is that the development of Christology, the development of Christological debate in the 6th century leads to a crisis of the classical theory that's inherited from the Cappadocians. And I say crisis very consciously, because it would be wrong to say that it gets rejected. There's some literature, some scholars have said things like about certain 6th century authors, they completely abandon the Cappadocian approach. You find dismissive statements about Gregory of Nyssa in John Philoponus, but Philoponus is an outlier and he is very, very atypical. I think by and large, it will be very, very hard to find, to the best of my knowledge, any 6th century Christian author regardless of which of the confessional camps they belong to, who wouldn't at one level acknowledge the foundational role of the Cappadocians. They're just too important to simply be abandoned. But there is a crisis, and the crisis is due to the fact that the classical theory doesn't really work with Christology, or that's at least my theory. There are people who disagree with me, but you won't be surprised to hear it from me. They are wrong. So what's the problem? The Cappadocian view, I said this already, was adopted for the purpose of Trinitarian doctrine. And it was for that reason geared towards unity. Universal being is key. Don't be deceived by the fact that ousia and hypostasis seem to be in a kind of symmetric relationship. I don't think that's really true. I think the key of the main focus of the Cappadocian theory is ousia, is oneness. And why am I so certain? Well, because in the Godhead, at the end of the day, oneness is key. Now, the hypostases are, of course, important. They're kind of existential carriers. The Godhead exists in three hypostases. But they aren't really all that different, right? I mean, we have perhaps one characteristic that is specific to each one of them. So I would say in the classical theory, hypostases are important in the plural, not in the singular. In other words, the classical theory doesn't actually really have a theory of the individual, and it doesn't need that, because in the Trinity, the Trinitarian persons aren't technically really individuals. They're not all that different from each other. Now, by contrast, Christology is, if it's anything, a theory about an individual. It's a theory about one individual, and that is the individual Jesus Christ. Some people might say, is this really the crux of Christology? Because it's hard, perhaps impossible, to have a theory about one individual. But again, that isn't my topic today. But it's important to see that if there is a theoretical, a conceptual need in Christology, it is to have an ability to explain an individual. Now, what does that mean in conceptual terms? Well, I give you one example again. Leontius of Byzantium, first half of the 6th century, writes his Epilysses, a kind of question and answer, or an attempt to answer certain aporiae that are offered to the Chalcedonian by their Miaphysite opponent. And the first problem that the opponent raises is this: in the incarnation, did the Logos take on universal or particular nature? That's the first problem, and I think it indicates that Leontius understood this was a very difficult one. Well, why is it difficult? Well, if you follow the classical theory, Cappadocian theory, the answer will be very easy. The whole point of nature, or ousia, or nature, physis, or substance, ousia, is that it's universal. That's right, and in that sense, it's an easy answer. But here's the problem, and that is, of course, what the opponent is banking on. Give me 1 second, sorry. The whole point, but universals are shared. Universals are shared. So if the Logos in the incarnation takes on human nature, and human nature is a universal, and it's characteristic of the universal that its predicates are predicated of every individual, then it would mean that in taking on the human nature, the Logos takes on or becomes incarnate in all humanity. Of course, the same problem works the other way around, right? If we say God becomes man, right? In the incarnation, God becomes human, we're clearly saying more than that somehow the individual hypostases of the Logos becomes human. In a way, it's God that becomes human. And yet, divine nature in this case cannot mean universal divine nature, because otherwise it would mean that Father and Spirit also become incarnate. This problem cannot be answered. This problem cannot be solved on the basis of the Cappadocian theory, which doesn't really have a theory of individuation and didn't have to, as I said earlier, because the doctrinal problem the Cappadocians tried to solve, the doctrine of the Trinity, doesn't really necessitate this. In fact, the doctrine of the Trinity, as we'll see in a moment, introducing a theory of individuation causes problems for Trinitarian theory. I'll say more about that in 1 minute. But if we look at normal creaturely genera and species, then we have this problem. It's well known to philosophers in late antiquity. So they say, if Socrates dies, it isn't just the individual, it is a human being that dies. But this doesn't mean that all human beings die. If the Logos becomes incarnate, God becomes man, but not the whole Trinity, and so on and so forth. So how can that be solved? Well, the philosophers resolved it by introducing individual or particular natures. We find that already, I think, in Alexander of Aphrodisias in the 2nd century. It becomes pretty much standard later on. So you're saying, well, there is universal nature qua universal, but there's also universal nature that is already individuated. So my humanity isn't the same as yours. And this idea that we have to introduce individual or particular natures in addition to universal nature is indeed found among Christian authors at roughly that time, when they recognized that there is a problem with the classical theory and Christology. So John Philoponus writes in his Arbiter, his attempt to persuade the emperor to adopt the Miaphysite position in the Second Council of Constantinople, so written in the early 550s. Philoponus writes, "For the common and universal account of human nature, albeit it is itself one, but when realized in many subjects becomes many, existing in each completely and not partially." Leontius of Byzantium, when responding to the question of whether the Logos assumed an individual or universal nature in the incarnation, gives the following answer. That's diplomacy perhaps. Christ assumed an individual nature, which is the same as the species. One could say a lot about that. I won't today, but we can see in different ways Philoponus and Leontius, a Miaphysite and a Chalcedonian, accept that probably you have to say that in the incarnation, individual or particular natures play a certain role. Now, is that the solution? Are we just talking about an addition or a completion of the classical theory? Well, life would be easy if that were the case. Unfortunately, it isn't. And the reason, sorry, one more. The reason it isn't is that the fact that individual natures are absent in Cappadocian theory wasn't just an oversight. Gregory of Nyssa didn't just forget to add this element to his theory. And we can see that where we see a Gregory arguing against the charge of tritheism. Isn't the Cappadocian doctrine of the Trinity, 3 hypostases and 1 ousia, isn't that tantamount to accepting 3 gods? Well, Gregory unsurprisingly says no, and his argument in favor of that rejection is to say we can't count deities in the Trinity because the Trinity is one substance, and one substance is a very, very strong statement. It does not permit counting these hypostases as many gods. And to drive his point home, he says, well, technically, we shouldn't do that even in the case of human beings. There is only, Gregory says, one man, one anthropos, heis anthropos, And we should really, if we wanted to speak correctly, we should say many hypostases of the one anthropos, not many three or whatever human beings. Now, not many people have, I think, ever been really convinced by Gregory's argument, but I think what is clear is that this only works because Gregory doesn't think, as Philoponus, that when the ousia becomes individuated in individuals, it is many. The ousia always stays one, and so it's clear that the moment we acknowledge that there are individual substances, we are practically pulling the rug from underneath the Cappadocian Trinitarian settlement. And that is indeed what happened almost immediately after the quotations I gave you from Leontius and John Philoponus in the so-called tritheist controversy. Now, that these people were tritheists is surely a polemical term, as in almost all doctrinal debates. The actual question that people started asking is, well, are there individual natures in the Trinity? Now, if people said it's important to say that in the incarnation, the Logos becomes human, not the Father, not the Son, the answer seems yes. It wasn't, though, just a philosophical determination. People started looking back at earlier patristic authorities, and they found that actually a lot of the 4th century fathers were quite happy to speak about the substance, the ousia of the Father, the ousia of the Son. And of course, the gem in the collection of quotations that they could adduce was nothing else but the Nicene Creed, where the Son said, from the ousia of the Father. Clearly, the Father, they would say, has his own ousia. Now, I mean, if that wasn't bad enough, after all, the whole point was that there's only one ousia in the Trinity. The next question was, can these individual ousia be counted as three? And this is really what the tritheist controversy amounts to. The so-called tritheists, including notably John Philoponus, emphatically said yes. If there are three individual substances, then we can count them as three. How could it be otherwise? Now, I mean, there's some really weird things about this controversy, and that partly because tritheism just sounds intuitively so incompatible with the Christian faith. It's hard to believe that this was ever more than a kind of hypothetical idea entertained by a couple of intellectuals. But that's not my topic. I mean, it was a real movement. They had their bishops and everything, right? Now, another thing I would want to say is that it's often seen as specifically a problem of the Miaphysite community. And it's true that this was specifically apparently a schism within the Miaphysite community, but I do think that it does illustrate the rise of tritheism, does illustrate the crisis of the classical theory, and in that sense shouldn't really be seen as just a problem of one particular religious group at the time. And with this, I come to my conclusion. Couple of points. I've try to give you a sense of the dramatic developments in patristic philosophy in the 6th century. The driver, I believe, is a Christological controversy, which necessitated a pretty radical adaptation of the classical theory inherited from the Cappadocians. The theory is modified. There are actually many different modifications. I simplified that for the purposes of this talk. But in all of these modifications, the new versions that we get are really in a pretty stark tension with its original form in the Cappadocians. Again, it doesn't mean the Cappadocians are simply kicked out. They remain normative, but they are now used in line with these new doctrinal needs. One really interesting trend there is that, surprisingly, given that the Cappadocians were the people who defined the doctrine of the Trinity with their particular conceptual apparatus, they're actually cited less and less in the Trinitarian context. So if you go, for example, beyond the 6th century, if you go to John of Damascus on the Orthodox faith, you'll find that the entire section on the Trinity hardly quotes the Cappadocians at all. Who becomes the main authority? Well, that's another very interesting story in the 6th century. Of course, it's Pseudo-Dionysius as the rising authority. The first, at least in Greek, to the best of my knowledge, the first evidence of sort of large-scale use of Dionysius is actually in the context of, we might say, apophatic statements on Trinitarian doctrine. And my suspicion is, well, that happens because apophatic language suddenly seems safer than the kind of analytic language that the Cappadocians had introduced. Well, there's much more to be said, but my time is up. I thank you for your attention, and now very happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Zachhuber, for this synthetic and still very dense overview of not only the 6th century indeed, but of the classical theory and the 6th century as it's a moment of its crisis, as was evident. I don't want, as a chair, to steal any floor to the discussion for the moment, so I am asking whether anyone wants to start with a Q&A. I will still wait.
Daria. There is Daria.
No, that's just, I think it's an applause.
No, she raised hand.
Did you, Daria?
I did. Yes, I did.
Okay, I'm sorry. I just misunderstood that. So
I didn't
please,
find
go on.
appropriate reaction. Thank you very much for this very comprehensive and provoking presentation. I have such a question. I often heard an account about Leontius of, for example, or of John Philoponus, as about the scholastic authors, not patristics, and even about Theodoret of Kyros in the 5th century, yes, already. So can we use this contrast, describing them as scholastic and not patristic writers, or is it not so relevant for the Eastern patristic thought? Thanks.
Thanks. That's a great question. I mean, my first answer would be that somehow, okay, what kind of term is patristic? It is, of course, in a way, a sort of theological term, and there may be reasons why certain churches consider some people as fathers and not others. I mean, where we're talking here, or certainly where I'm talking about sort of historical categories. Now, when it comes to historical categories, I would say, well, a lot of it's in the eye of the beholder, right? I mean, if somebody says, let's end, we can say the last father was, I don't know, Cyril of Alexandria or whatever, then I think, okay, fair enough. Of course, things change in the 6th century. There's no doubt about it. I mean, but my sense is, usually people are happy to see a continuity at least to the 8th century. Now, the term scholastic, you see, that is very, very interesting. I mean, I do think, I mean, again, the question is, how do we discuss that? How do we define that? I think there's no doubt that in a sense, the 6th century, the sort of the advance of doctrinal debate that we're seeing leads to an increase in a sort of technicalities of argument, including an emphasis on how do we define this term, how do we interpret this statement by Basil. So you want to call that scholastic? Fair enough. You can probably do that. I mean, it is definitely true. One real problem that that the Christian authors in the 6th century and beyond have is that somehow they feel there's a life and death struggle between Nestorianism and monophysitism, or whatever word they would use for their opponents and themselves. But of course, the reality is, in the grand scheme of things, they all agreed on an enormous amount, right? They agreed on scripture, they agreed on Nicaea, they agreed on the Cappadocians, they agreed, they had so many authors actually in common. So it was much more difficult than perhaps in the Gnostic controversy about Gnosticism to simply say, well, obviously you're using this gospel and this gospel is just wrong. There weren't really all, there weren't all that many sort of obvious ways you could say why you're right and the other side is wrong. And I think that is one reason why these arguments become more sophisticated, right? Not apart from the Easterns, the Miaphysites and the Chalcedonians both really want to think of themselves as Cyrillians in their Christology. But you think, well, it's hard to think that they both were. Or perhaps they're both thinking of different aspects in Cyril's works. But in any event, how do you do that? Well, the only way you can actually differentiate your position is either by going into massive detail of exegesis of Cyril's text, or by really sort of sidestepping the question of tradition and authority and really asking what kind of operational logic is more plausible. And I think that's some of what we're seeing there.
Thank you. We have another question from Giovanni Mandolino.
Thank you. Two quick questions. One, what do we make of what we traditionally call patristic theology within your methodological view, within your thinking of patristic thought as a form of philosophy? And is this philosophy concerned with one problem only, namely Usian hypostasis, or are there other topics that were discussed within? And the second final question is, I read your book about the rise of Christian theology and the end of ancient metaphysics, and you mentioned that patristic philosophy reaches a distinction between essence and existence somehow. And in my mind, this idea, distinction of essence and existence, is associated with Avicenna in medieval philosophy. So are you saying that it is not his original idea at all, that we should look to previous thinkers? And thank you.
Yeah, so thanks. Great questions. I begin with the second one, which is easy. Indeed, I wanted to be a bit provocative there, right? Because the standard answer that a scholar of ancient philosophy will always give to you, or even late ancient philosophy, is to say the distinction between essence and existence doesn't exist in antiquity. It's a medieval thing. And I want to say, well, if it's a medieval thing, well, perhaps it's still not a totally novel idea. And the medievals knew John of Damascus, for example, and so perhaps they found it there. So there's perhaps a way of understanding this development, because part of what I really wanted to do in this book is not merely to say, okay, well, we've got a new niche, and we can sort of spend our scholarly time studying these patristic authors as philosophers because we don't have anything else to do. But for anybody who isn't interested in that niche, this isn't kind of relevant. I wanted to say, well, actually, even though people don't pay attention to this, there are ways to argue that this patristic philosophy exerted considerable influence in its innovative potential on the Western Middle Ages. I'm even hypothesize, I don't know how successful, possibly even via the Syriac tradition on early Islamic philosophy, on early modern philosophy. So that's kind of what I'm getting at. Is it true? Well, I think we'll have to talk for a long time to medieval scholars to see whether that makes sense or not. But it is certainly what I wanted to suggest. Now, your first question is a bit more difficult for me to answer, because it is an issue about which I myself thought a lot, and I'm not sure I really have an absolutely perfect answer. I mean, I would say, so you say, you say we conventionally call this patristic theology. Now, one interesting observation is that theology isn't actually what patristic authors call their own work most of the time, right? So the term theologia, especially as a discipline and as such kind of distinct from philosophy, is first attested in the Western Middle Ages. Interestingly, in connection, I think, with the foundation of the University of Paris. So you have theology faculty, philosophy faculty. The word theologia is, of course, a patristic term, right? Goes back to Aristotle and God knows how long. But it isn't. They wouldn't say. Origen wouldn't say, "Well, read, wouldn't say my collected works are Origen's theology." So that's why I feel I'm sometimes tempted to think, well, there is a kind of broad sense in which perhaps it may be more appropriate to think of Christian theology in its entirety, including exegesis, including sort of ethics, including doctrine, as one huge form of philosophy. But then I admit that the way I'm talking about it today is a more restricted view, where philosophy is really just a sort of theoretical underpinning on which then doctrinal debates are conducted. And so perhaps I really have to admit that I'm somewhat cheekily operating with a sort of broader and a narrower idea of Christian philosophy, and I suspect I'll have to work that out at some point in the future, but thank you for raising it.
Thank you very much for these exchanges. Other questions? Okay, I see two hands. Let me check where they are. Bishara, do you see them? I'm not. Okay, Bishara himself and Alberto. So I don't know the order.
No, Alberto.
Raising.
I give the question to Alberto.
Okay, please, Alberto.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. It's just really a small point that came to mind as I was listening to your talk on particularly on tritheism or tritheism, and then the point that Daria made, which is tritheism is such an interesting development in the 6th century, of which I wish I knew more. But it's obviously something that was important and that followers, and we can track it down. My understanding is that there is a lot of John Philoponus behind it. But I'm thinking about a text that, as far as I know, doesn't exist in a modern translation, is Anastasius of Antioch, who wrote a dialogue between Orthodox and the Tritate, I think you would say.
I know the text.
It's a fascinating text. Obviously, it's very much against Miaphysitism, and then sort of tritheism builds on that. And it's a text that has not been studied a lot, so I'm not very familiar with the text itself. But I think there was some scholarship on it, bringing in the idea that from this Chalcedonian perspective of Anastasius of Antioch, tritheism could be understood as the application of Aristotelian logic to the field, to this field, and perhaps something that goes back to John Philoponus. But that may be part of the hostility coming from Anastasius of Antioch. Is this part of the picture in your view, or what is going on at this time, or how can we sort of understand this? I mean, I think tritheism is fascinating as a development.
It's totally fascinating. I mean, sorry, that's always just kind of easy thing to say. I have a pretty extensive section devoted to tritheism in my book. And I totally agree with you. It's incredibly fascinating. I mean, actually, Anastasius is one of the authors I perhaps should have discussed and didn't. So a couple of things. I mean, I know there are essentially two schools when it comes to tritheism, right? I mean, there are the ones who say, well, this is all Philoponus, and it's all because Philoponus was an Aristotelian and didn't believe in universals. Now, I mean, the reality is, I think tritheism existed for about 10 years. Philoponus didn't do anything to interact with it. Finally, he came on board. And then, of course, he wrote his own books, of which we have very, very few fragments. If we look at the history of tritheism, that's for which we have some church historians. Michael the Syrian in his chronicle has some evidence. It is, I would say, I mean, that's what I was also trying to say in my talk. There's a lot of evidence that this was driven. I mean, that the initial approach was, well, we have patristic proof texts, and the proof texts show that the fathers speak of individual natures in the deity. Now, the problem was, and this is why it was indeed, in a way, Anastasius is right, it was a bigger problem for the Miaphysites, because the Miaphysites actually were on board with the idea, sort of mainstream Miaphysites, Severan Miaphysites were on board with the idea that there are individual natures in the deity, because they felt that that could explain the incarnation. They weren't obviously tritheists, but if we look, there is, for example, an absolutely fascinating text by the Miaphysite patriarch of Alexandria, Theodosius, who writes against the tritheists. And I mean, it's kind of, he's totally helpless, right? He's totally helpless because he has to concede all their points in patristic exegesis. And then at the end of the day, he says, well, but you're not supposed to draw the conclusion that simply because there are three individual natures in the Godhead, you should say there are three. You're just doing that to confuse the simple-minded Christians. And so I think, you know, that's where Anastasius is right. I mean, what's so interesting in my view about Anastasius is as far as, yes, of course he says it's Aristotelianism, but I always tend to discard this a little because it's just the kind of same old. You will always say that your opponents have been, Eunomius was an Aristotelian, and all the heretics are sort of influenced by philosophy. But what I think Anastasius really does, and what's interesting in the context of what I was talking about today, he radically denies individual or particular natures. He tries to go back in a way to the Cappadocian model and says, well, universals are universals and individuals are individuals. And the question is to what extent that actually helps him in his own Chalcedonian Christology. He is himself an absolutely understudied author, but that's certainly what I take his strategy to mean, that he essentially says we will not touch this whole, it seems to be an elegant way out to introduce these individual natures, but this is not what Chalcedonians do, because if you do it, then you're a Miaphysite and then you're ultimately a tritheist. And so you kind of, you nip this in the bud, if you see what I mean. But we should have a seminar on Anastasius. I think that will be very interesting.
Thank you, Bishara.
Just if there is a time, my question is very simple. Yeah, my question is from. During the 6th century and beyond, the question was about from Christology to Trinitarian doctrine. Like each confession, each church tried to remodify the metaphysics or the metaphysical system of its doctrine to answer the open questions that their Christology that remained after their So my question is, it's not just that the Cappadocian system was not the solution, and they tried to find a solution in the so-called three states of being, a modified version of three states of being, each confession from another point of view to resolve the problems or the crisis in the Trinitarian doctrine.
I'm so sorry, but there was something about the sound. I couldn't. Can you just very quickly sort of summarize again? I mean, I heard that you were asking about the three system. I'm so sorry. I mean, there were a couple of words I just didn't catch here.
Well, my question was, if is it about a modified version of the three states of being that each confession in the East tried to give answers to the metaphysical system, and not the use of the distinction of the Cappadocians itself.
Yes, exactly. I think that I think, well, I mean, you know, one question I really have, and I need to go, you know, if I have time, you know, I need to read Babai the Great, which I must admit I haven't done yet. I sometimes wonder whether or not for the East Syrians it may almost have been easiest, because, and I don't know that, right? Because they come up with this idea of two natures and two hypostases in the incarnation. And of course, you know, they probably had other problems as a result of that. But I kind of almost wonder that that's not in some ways closest to the original Cappadocian theory. But for the Chalcedonians and for the Miaphysites, I think it's absolutely true that they had to sort of fix their way around the authority of the Cappadocians with essentially modified, in some ways very new novel theories. And of course, and again, I mean, this paper was simplifying things, right? I mean, there are differences between them. I mean, Severus, I mean, the Miaphysites, I think in general, and certainly Severus of Antioch initially thinks it's absolutely crazy to believe that the Cappadocian system has to be used to explain Christology. So, I mean, to me, one of the fascinating things that happened in the early 6th century is, you know, why? We have Cyril. Cyril is the authority for Christology. Why should it be the Cappadocians? And actually, certainly my own insight, which may be not perfect, but my own insight in my book was, it is true that in the 5th century, even though people generally applied the Cappadocian view to pretty much everything, they hardly did so to Christology. But people like John the Grammarian put that to Severus, and within a couple of years, really, few decades, it is more or less generally acknowledged that this general framework of ousia and hypostases somehow has to be applied to Christology as well. But of course, you know, in modification, as you say. All this needs more research, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
Yes, of course.
Are there other comments? Otherwise, I would have one, but I'm keeping it for later. No, then perhaps I can jump in and ask you whether we might say so that the crisis of the 6th century is in a sense twofold. So there is one aspect of the crisis is that the classical theory doesn't really work with Christology. And then the second facet, the second aspect is that once you try to adjust it to Christology, then you have repercussions on the Trinity. So these are the two facets of the crisis. And then if it is so that these are the two aspects, then isn't this crisis already completely inscribed in Gregory of Nyssa? I mean, Gregory, you say, excuse me if I quote you, but it's just to set to fix my thought to concrete statement. So you at the end of your chapter on the Cappadocians proper, you write that this commitment to the full and complete instantiation of universal nature into its constituent hypostasis also exhausts the role the latter, so the hypostasis, have to play in Cappadocian ontology.
Mm-hmm.
So in some ways, it seems that the universal qua universal has already received its instantiation in a sort of, not so called by Gregory of Nyssa, but substantially it is its individual nature. So the individual, and not by chance, there already is a problem with tritheism in Gregory of Nyssa. So isn't it so that the whole development, without being called so no individual nature, no tritheism, but bottom line, it is already inscribed in Gregory of Nyssa?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I suspect I want to talk more about it, Emilio. My gut reaction will be no. And I mean, it depends a little bit on how seriously we take Gregory's defense against tritheism. Of course, if we say, well, you know, this is just rhetoric.
Yes.
Then you may be right. I mean, I'm inclined to give him more credit. I'm inclined to say no. I mean, it's partly because I read his anti-tritheism, for example, alongside his cosmological work, which I think is also really, you know, his account of creation, where I feel it is driven by a notion that there's unity, and the unity kind of just unfolds into plurality. I mean, one of the things that to me is very interesting is that, I mean, if I'm right, you know, in his cosmological treatises, Gregory actually doesn't even operate with a duality of terms like ousia and hypostasis. It's more like physis or ousia in its totality, and then in its kind of individuated bits. And so I think it's and so I think there is, he does. Yeah, I mean, I really think that the problem is that there's not really an emphasis on, I mean, that even though he says that the only subsisting realities are hypostases,
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't really help him explain sort of individuality. But perhaps the reality is, I feel, as you rightly said, I've spent many years thinking about it, and whenever I thought I'd finally resolved the problem, I realized I had to start again. So perhaps that's still the case, although I was hoping I'd close the book by writing the book.
Yeah, that's and thank you for doing it. So we have it now. Yes, perhaps the open question, but perhaps it's not the right question, is whether indeed there is already something like you mentioned it right now. So the physis is universal and in a sort of continuity individual. And is this not the basic principle underlying the individual nature?
That's so interesting.
In a sense. So
I guess the reason why I thought it's different, I mean, I'm also looking at it from a slightly different angle, right? I mean, again, why do we have the problem of tritheism? Well, because you know, well, okay, Neil, no, let me put it a slightly different way. I mean, if we look at the Aristotelian commentators, they're Platonists, right? Or people often say they have a sort of nominalist streak. And why is that? Because the moment I think it's true that the moment you accept that universals are kind of individuated in particulars, you know, as Simplicius and all these authors, they say, well, the only true universal is the reflected universal, because out there in reality, it is sort of broken down into individuals. And my assumption has always been that somehow Gregory of Nyssa wants things differently. He wants to say, no, there is a real, he is a realist in the sense that he actually thinks that the many human individuals are one man. And that in that sense, I think he means it, that there are many many men, many anthropoi.
Yes.
I get your point. I get your point. Of course, the problem is, someone might say the problem of universals can't be resolved anyway, because
no, indeed.
I
but
mean,
I'm sure...
and I mean, and there's a reason why people go back and forth over it for centuries. As I said, I'm very, very happy to talk more about that. But as I mean, it seems to, yeah, but I mean, at the end of the day, it seems to me that there's a way people actually understood for a long time that the Cappadocian theory is very helpful, and that they intuitively applied it to cosmology, they applied it to universal sin, they applied it to salvation, they applied it to sacramental theology. They didn't apply it to Christology, and I think they sort of knew perhaps what they were doing. And then some of these 6th century Chalcedonians, who were pretty much with the back to the wall at the time, felt it was the stroke of genius to rebut Severus by saying, well, the real authority, namely the Cappadocians, is on our side, because human and divine nature in the Savior are just universal natures, and that is just the right way of thinking about Christ as human and divine.
Yes. I'm sorry. It's a very subtle nuance about individual natures there in the individuation. So I'm perhaps not yet able to really fully grasp there, and then hence my question.
No, I'm not saying that at all. It isn't. Well, you're absolutely
I'm
right.
saying
it is subtle. It is subtle, and that's why I think it's very hard to be absolutely sure. But I'm just giving you the best understanding to which I've advanced myself.
Thank you very much. Are there any other remarks, questions, any curiosity to unravel, to solve? Yes, I have another hand. Please go on, Luis Josué Celes.
Hi, thank you very much. I have a question just in terms of how this discussion that you were just having with Emiliano played out later. For example, by the time that you reach somebody like Maximus the Confessor, he's totally on board with claiming that there are no universals outside of the individuals who instantiate them as a species. And I'm wondering how, what happened in the interim that became kind of the intuitive response.
Yes, I mean, Maximus is a really interesting case. There is, I have a chapter Maximus in my book as well. I feel I'm in his case, I feel I'm going out on a limb more than almost any other author. So I mean, Maximus is very, very interesting. I mean, in some ways, in some ways we could have a much easier life. I could have an easier life. We all, perhaps, if we kind of just forget about the 6th century and jump from the Cappadocians more or less directly to Maximus, and on the way there just pick up a little bit of Dionysius, because, and in some ways that's it seems to me it's possible to read Maximus as really just reaffirming in a very fundamental way the way Gregory taught, plus of course applying it to Christology, right? Applying it to Christology. Now I'm not entirely sure. The problems that were pointed out by non-Chalcedonians in the 6th century, are they actually really addressed in Maximus? And I think by and large they aren't. Is that bad? Well, the explanation to which I adopt in my book, but as I said, I'm not, in Maximus's case, I'm really not entirely sure it's correct. The explanation I adopt is a mix of theology and history. And I say, well, you know, Maximus lives through that period of time. The big problem up until then was that the Chalcedonians and the Miaphysites both lived in the same country, right? I mean, that's why it was such a huge thing for the emperors and for the bishops. They were not divided into different countries. Now, that effectively changed in the 7th century with the Arabic conquest. From then on, the Miaphysites were practically outside of the empire. And I kind of wonder whether or not Maximus saw that there was a kind of opportunity in this massive crisis. And the opportunity was to say, look, you know what? We got bogged down in an endless turf war between Miaphysite arguments here, Chalcedonian arguments there, and in a way we make little progress. And the only thing that happens, as somebody said earlier, is that the theology becomes more scholastic and less attractive. Instead, we kind of just sort of forget about a lot of that. We try to sort of reimagine Chalcedonian Christology as something that is just a genuine extension of Cappadocian doctrine, and I think that's at least for me is a plausible way of understanding what he did. And you know, that's in my view would also explain why, you know, he then collaborates with the Latins against his own emperor, and you know, is doing all these sort of shenanigans. But anyway, I mean, that's just where I stand. And I mean, I would feel a little confirmed in that interpretation by seeing that John of Damascus, who of course isn't in Byzantium, right? He is lives in the Caliphate 100 years later, is more or less back to a lot of the, I mean, it takes much more seriously again the constellation. I think that's been characteristic of the 6th century than as far as I can tell Maximus does. But once, I mean, what I said to Emilio is more true is more true in this case. I really just feel you know, we need more time to talk about that.
Thank you very much for this. Yes, so Luis Celeste is thanking you via chat, and so thank you very much. I think we've run out of time for the moment, so 1 hour and a half was foreseen, more or less, and moreover, we wouldn't like to keep our speaker, especially considering his imperfect health. So all the more we consider a great gift this grand kickoff you gave to our series, you offered to our series, and the discussion was rich in the sense that it touched upon a substantial number of crucial points that should be, and I hope will be also in private conversations with you, Professor Zachhuber, further developed and tackled. So I'm just